Good morning again, as Wayne's already said. Good to see everybody in the house of God today. And I've been reminded that it's my duty to do the drawing of the names now. I forgot about that. So, Lord willing, we'll be drawing names next Sunday. So just remember that next Sunday. We'll just do it like we always do. Send a pad around if you want to draw names, put your name on it. We'll take about 5 minutes at the end of the class to actually draw the names. And Brother Wayne, he'll be teaching next week, so we'll be praying for him this week. We'll ask him to teach next week. So, again, if you want to draw names, remember that next week. We'll try to draw names, and I'll try to remember to remind Wayne again. Judy, you may have to help us out. Pam, y'all may have to help us remember that. Laura May will help me remember, I know for sure, if I forget, because she's the one that reminded me this morning. So, all right, Job chapter 19. If you want to go ahead and be turning back, Job chapter 19, we got down to verse 13 last week, so Lord willing, that's where we'll take up again this week and get started back into our lesson. But before we get started, we'll have a word of prayer and then get on into the lesson. Doyle, will you open us up in prayer this morning?
Dear blessed Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. Let's get up this morning.
Yes, Lord.
Church, no other place, Lord, we'd rather be, Lord, than right here. And thank you for helping us. I pray you bless this gathering this morning. Bless all the teachers.
Yes.
Today I pray for Perry as he talks about Job and his experiences and related to our lives. And I just pray you bless the service, bless the singing, the preaching, all it's done today. Lord, thank you and praise you for it all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right. All right, Job 19, just a brief recap what we talked about last week. Bildad had finished up his second speech or his second sermon. And we talked about the 4 terrors of death that he mentioned, or things that would happen to the wicked man. And then that was in chapter 18. In chapter 19, we started looking into Job's response. And Job responded by describing some of the trials of life, and really related to his life in particular. And he first talked about some of the insults that he had received from his friends, chapter 19. Verses 1 through 4, and then in chapter 19, verses 5 through 12, he gave some illustrations that some of the trials of his life could be compared to, and we looked at a few of those things last week as it pertains to that. And then we had started looking at how sometimes the trials in our lives and sufferings actually causes isolation, maybe from some of the people that are most dear to us, and that's where we got. So I had already read verses 13 through 22, but let me reread those. Job chapter 19, let me begin in verse number 13 and read down through verse 22 and look at some of the people that these sufferings caused isolation to in Job's life. But Job 19 verse 13, He hath put my brethren far from me, and mine acquaintance are verily estranged from me. My kinsfolk have failed, and my familiar friends have forgotten me. They that dwell in mine house and my maids count me for a stranger. I am an alien in their sight. I called my servant, and he gave me no answer. I entreated with him. I entreated him with my mouth. My breath is strange to my wife, though I entreated for the children's sake of mine own body. Yea, young children despised me. I arose, and they spake against me. All my inward friends abhorred me, and they whom I loved are turned against me. My bone cleaveth to my skin and to my flesh, and I am escaped with the skin of my teeth. Have pity upon me, have pity upon me, O ye my friends, for the hand of God hath touched me. Why do you persecute me as God, and are not satisfied with my flesh? So Job here, he goes on in these verses to describe sometime how the sufferings of life and the trials of life actually can cause isolation, and it can affect relationships with other people. Maybe not intentionally, but that's just what happens sometimes when we go through suffering and trial. And that's what happened here in Job's life. Look what he said here in some of these verses. Verse 13, he talked about how he said, my brethren are far from me. And in verse 13 again, he talks about how his acquaintance or his friends are estranged from him, or they're turned away from him, even his friends. And in verse 14, it talks about his kinsfolk have failed him. So even his own family, seems to have been isolated from him. And then also in verse number 14, he talks about how his familiar friends have forgotten him. And those familiar friends there would be his close friends. And it says in verse 15 and 16, it talks about his servants count him as even a stranger and an alien, even in his own house. And then in verse 17, he says his wife was even isolated from him. It says his breath was even strange to his wife. So because of these sufferings going on in his life, his wife had even become isolated from him. And in verse 18, it talks about how young children even despised him. And then again in verse number 19, it talks about how his inward friends abhorred him. And that just means abhor means to hate. And the inward friends here would be his closest friends. So he talks about three different sets of friends. It talks about his acquaintance, which was his regular friends, his familiar friends, which would have been his close friends, but even his inward friends, his closest friends that he had, because of the trials that were going on in his life, seemed to be isolated from him and how it affected the relationship with them. So he explains some of these things in here, and that's what happens sometimes. And again, it may not be intentionally, but just sometimes that's the way things work out with sufferings. We become isolated in ourselves. And in verse number 20, the last part of verse number 20, that's a very familiar but often misquoted verse. It actually says, I am escaped with the skin of my teeth, not by the skin of my teeth. And we say that a lot of times. And when we say you've escaped by the skin of your teeth, that just means you just barely escaped something, right? But that's not what he said. He escaped with the skin of his teeth. Because remember, Job didn't feel like he had escaped anything. He was trying to get away from some things, but he hadn't really escaped anything here. So it's not really 100% certain maybe what he may have meant by this particular phrase here. It could have been that he says, well, if, skin really did have teeth, then that's all I'm left with. In other words, it's just a miracle that I'm still alive because of all the suffering and the things that were going on here in my life. So, again, possibly, we don't really know exactly. But again, it's sometimes a misquoted part of the verse there. And then verse 21 and 22 here, he talks about, he asked pity again of his friends twice. In verse number 21, he says, have pity upon me, O ye my friends. So he's still asking for pity and sympathy and empathy from his friends. It doesn't seem to be getting much of it, but he's still asking from it. Because again, remember he's talking about how he feels isolated from his friends and from his family and everybody else in his life. So he wants more pity on him because of the way other people are treating him. So that's another trial of life that he discusses. And then the last one here in verses 23 through 29, Job actually, because of the trials and sufferings that are going on in his life, he actually gets some insight in some things maybe that he may not would have known otherwise. Let me read those verses. Job 19, verses 23 through 29, the rest of the chapter. He says, oh, that my words were now written, oh, that they were printed in a book, that they were graven with an iron pen, and laid in the rock forever. For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God, whom I shall see for myself, and mine eyes shall behold, and not another, though my reins be consumed within me. But ye should say, why persecute we him, seeing the root of the matter is found in me? Be ye afraid of the sword, for wrath bringeth the punishments of the sword, that ye may know there is a judgment. So Job here, he's telling us in verses 23 and 24 how that he wants his story to be written down so it would stand forever, so people could learn and people could read about him and maybe get help and strength and encouragement because of the things he's going to. Now remember, Bildad told Job back in chapter number 18 that his remembrance would perish from the earth. He was talking about the ungodly man or the wicked man, but we know that Job's three friends, when they were talking about the wicked and ungodly men, they were actually pointing those words to Job, and they were telling Job that he was that kind of man. And so he said, your remembrance would perish from the earth. Well, we know that God, of course, heard and answered Job's prayer on this particular part, because we're standing here today day, and we're reading and studying the book of Job. So it did get written down, and it will last forever. And so that was a prayer that was answered here that Job had prayed. And verses 25 through 27, you remember, first of all, you remember back in chapter number 13 when we talked about one of the greatest statements or one of the greatest declarations of faith that we had recorded. Job 13 verse 15 says, remember, he said, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. We talked about that and what a great statement of faith that was. Well, here, now we see another one. Let me reread verses 25 through 27. This is another great statement of faith by Job. He says, for I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day on the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God, whom I shall see for myself, and mine own eyes shall behold, and not another, though my reins be consumed within me. So remember, given the limited information that Job had about life after death, because remember, he didn't have the scriptures like we have today. We've talked about that multiple times. It makes this statement even that much more amazing that Job could actually make a statement like this. Look what he says in verse 25. He said, I know that my Redeemer is alive. And also in verse 25, he says, I know he'll stand on the earth in the end. And in verse 26, he says also, I know that I'm going to see him. In verse number 27, he says, with my own eyes. He says, I'm going to see him, and I'm not going to depend on what somebody else has to say, but I'm going to see him with my own eyes. So what a great statement of faith here this was as well that Job had to make. And then notice he closes in verse 28 and 29. He closes his speech here, or his response here to his three friends, by giving them a warning. And he reminds them that they too, just like himself, would one day stand before God at the judgment. And so they had better be ready, just as like they was trying to get Job ready, trying to get him right, trying to get him to confess his sins which he had not committed. And so he would be ready to stand before the judgment of God. He reminds them that they too needed to be ready as well. And these words here of Job reminds us of some passages in the New Testament we have about the judgment. Let me read those. Romans chapter 14 verse number 10 says, but why dost thou judge thy brother? Why dost thou set at naught thy brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. For it is written, as I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God, so that every one of us shall give account of himself to God. And also in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, judge not, that you be not judged, for with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged, and what measure you mete, it shall be measured to you again. And why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own eye? Or how wilt thou say to thy brother, let me pull out the mote out of thine eye, and behold, a beam is in thine own eye? Thou hypocrite, first cast out the beam out of thine own eye, then shalt thou see clearly to cast out the mote out of thy brother's eye. Of course, we know these passages weren't pinned down at the time that Job lived, at the time that Job's story was written. But this is the same thing that Job's friends was doing to him. You know, they had sin and things in their lives, but they were trying to get the sin out of Job's life. So these passages here apply to the things that were going on here in Job's life and his three friends' lives. So that's Bildad's second speech. Job's response here to Bildad's second speech in chapter number 19. And now we get to chapter number 20, and we see Zophar. He gets to speak again. And this is his second speech or sermon. Some of them, if you've got different, depending on what kind of Bible you got, some call them speeches, some call them discourses, some call them sermons, just different things. But this is Zophar's second one here in chapter number 20 we'll look at, and then Job responds to him in chapter number 21. So this second speech here of Zophar, it's more of the same. He's talking about how God punishes the wicked. So Job, you must have sinned and you're wicked and you need to get right with God. It's pretty much the same thing over and over. These guys didn't have a whole lot of new information to give Job. Seemed like every time they spoke, they just seemed to rehash the things they had already said. So let's just briefly here just look at some of the things here that Zophar does have to say to Job in his second speech. Let me start by reading the first three verses And then just, again, just briefly comment on a few of these things down through here. But Job 20, verse number 1, then answered Zophar the Naamathite and said, therefore do my thoughts cause me to answer, and for this I make haste. I have heard the check of my reproach, and the spirit of my understanding causeth me to answer. So apparently Zophar here was disturbed and maybe even insulted by Job's last speech. So he felt, well, he says, Job, I got to talk again. He says, I got to make another speech because you've insulted me, you've made me mad by some of the things here that you've just said in chapter number 19. So I guess if Zophar had a title probably to his speech or sermon, or his second sermon here to Job, it would probably be how he talks again about the terrible fate of the wicked and the things that are going to happen to the wicked. And again, that's the general theme that we've seen in all three of these guys. That seems to be the general theme. They keep telling Job what's going to happen to the wicked. And Job, because you are wicked, these things are going to happen to you. So let's look at verses 4 through 11 and see the first thing he talks about, the fate of the wicked, is Zophar talks about how their life is going to be brief. So let's look at verses 4 through 11. He says, knowest thou not this of old, since man was placed upon earth, that the triumphing of the wicked is short, and the joy of the hypocrite but for a moment? Though his excellency mount up to the heavens, and his head reach into the clouds, yet he shall perish forever like his own dung. They which have seen him shall say, where is he? He shall fly away as a dream, and shall not be found. Yea, he shall be chased away as a vision of the night. The eye also which saw him shall see him no more, neither shall his place any more behold him. His children shall seek to please the poor, and his hand shall restore their goods. His bones are full of the sin of his youth, which shall lie down with him in the dust. So Zophar here, he talks about how the life of the wicked is going to be brief, but not really sure where he gets his information. Notice here in verse 4, he says, knowest thou not this of old, since man was placed on the earth, that the triumphing of the wicked is short? Because if you remember, God waited 120 years before he destroyed the earth with a flood in the days of Noah. We know how the Bible talks about wickedness was all over the place. Well, he had patience, I think 120 years, so he waited 120 years before he brought judgment then. And what about when the children of Israel, they were in Egyptian bondage for 400 years. And the wicked Egyptians were over them, they making them slaves and everything. So before that God brought judgment to Egypt and to the Pharaoh, they were there for 400 years. So we're not really sure what Zophar is basing his information on here, that the life of the wicked is always brief, because it may or may not be. And we'll talk about that more in Job's response in chapter number 29. So Zophar goes on to explain here in verses 6 through 11. We won't take time to read those, what happens to the wicked. But we've discussed in the past that God doesn't put a timetable on how or when he will judge the wicked or the just or the righteous man, or how long the wicked may live, or how long the just may live. So God doesn't really put a timetable on that. So Zophar, again, his theory that wicked's life is always brief is not necessarily true. But then verse number 12 through 17, he talks about how that the pleasure of the wicked is only temporary. Let me read verses 12 through 17. Though wickedness be sweet in his mouth, though he hide it under his tongue, though he spare it, and forsake it not, but keep it still within his mouth, yet his meat in his bowels is turned. It is the gall of asp within him. He has swallowed down riches, and he shall vomit them up again. God shall cast them out of his belly. He shall suck the poison of asp. The viper's tongue shall slay him. He shall not see the rivers, the floods, the brooks of the honey and butter. So Zophar, notice that he uses the image here of eating when he's comparing the wicked and sin of the wicked. He said the wicked man enjoys sin, like people enjoy food today. You get something that tastes good, you want to keep it in your mouth, and enjoy that right long as you can. But he says it's just like that. He said if you keep it in your mouth too long, he said you're gonna vomit it out. It's going to become poison to you. And that's how he's comparing. Zophar's comparing sin here to the wicked, same way as he's comparing eating to. And again, we see some partial truths again here, talking about how that the pleasure is only temporary, because we know what Hebrews 11:25 says, talking about Moses. He says, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. So again, Zophar, he mixes in a little truth here with his sermon, and it makes it sound a whole lot better when he mixes in some of these partial truths. So some of what he says here about the pleasures being temporary could possibly be true. But then the last thing he talks about in chapter 20, verses 18 through 29, he says that the death of the wicked is always painful. And again, that may or may not necessarily be true. But let's read these verses 18 through the rest of the chapter. He says, that which he labored for shall he restore, and shall not swallow it down. According to his substance shall the restitution be, and he shall not rejoice therein. Because he hath oppressed and hath forsaken the poor, because he hath violently taken away an house which he built not. Surely he shall not feel quietness in his belly, he shall not save of that which he desired. There shall none of his meat be left, therefore shall no man look for his goods. In the fullness of his sufficiency he shall be in straits, every hand of the wicked shall come upon him. When he is about to fill his belly, God shall cast the fury of his wrath upon him, and shall rain it upon him while he is eating. He shall flee from the iron weapon, and the bow of steel shall strike him through. It is drawn and cometh out of the body, yea, the glittering sword cometh out of his gall. Terrors are upon him. All darkness shall be hid in his secret places. A fire not blown shall consume him. It shall go ill with him that is left in his tabernacle. The heaven shall reveal his iniquity. The earth shall rise up against him. The increase of his house shall depart, and his goods shall flow away in the day of his wrath. This is the portion of the wicked man from God, and the heritage appointed unto him by God. So he closes there in verse number 29. It says, Job, this is what's going to happen to the wicked. This is the portion of the wicked from God. This is a heritage appointed him to God. So we see here maybe in verses 18 through 22, he talks about that not even riches will be able to prevent death from coming to a wicked man. Not only a wicked man, but any man. We know that to be true. It doesn't matter what you have. You're not going to take anything you've got with you when you die. So wealth and riches, as he refers in these verses 18 through 22, it's not going to help a man when it comes time for him to die. It's just not going to help him. Then verse number 23, Zophar here, he talks about how God will catch him and cast the fury of his wrath upon him. Remember, we're talking about how Zophar says that the death of the wicked is always painful. Look at some of the things here he goes on to describe in verses 24 through 28. Verse number 24, he uses an iron weapon and a bow of steel. Those are two things. You know, that would be a painful way to die if you got killed with those two things, wouldn't it? Verse number 25 talks about a glittering sword. So that would be a very, very painful way to die as well. Verse 26 talks about being in darkness. And in verse number 28, he talks about how all his goods shall flow away. So Zophar, I believe he really believes these things he's telling Job, that he really believes that the death of the wicked will always be painful. And he's warning Job of this. And when he's talking about the wicked, he's really referring or directing all these comments to Job. So he finishes up here his second sermon, whatever, in chapter number 20. And then, you see, Job starts to reply in verse number 21. And he starts out in verses 1 through 6 just asking his friends for some understanding again. Remember, he's done this multiple times. Seems like about every time that Job starts his reply to one of these speeches from his friends, he asks again for sympathy and pity and more understanding. So that's the same way that he starts off his reply again here in chapter number 21. So let me read verses 1 through 6, just briefly make some comments about that. But then the latter part of the chapter, he's actually going to refute some of the things that Zophar had said in chapter number 20. And that's really what I want to look at. But verses 1 through 6, chapter 21, here again, Job's response, he said, But Job answered and said, Hear diligently my speech, and let this be your consolation. Suffer me that I may speak, and after that I have spoken, mock on. As for me, is my complaint to man? If it were so, why should not my spirit be troubled? Mark me and be astonished, and lay your hand upon your mouth. Even when I remembered, I am afraid, and trembling taketh hold on my flesh. So Job here, listen to what he says here in some of these verses. First of all, that's how he starts out. He says, listen to what I have to say here in chapter number 2. And he said, I want you to listen. But even after you listen, if you want to continue to mock me, he said, just go ahead. He says, just mock on there in verse number 3. And then in verse number 4, he says, look, my complaint's not necessarily with you guys, with men. Job felt like his complaint was to God, because he felt like God was the one that causing these things to come in his life because Satan had allowed it. And we know that God had allowed Satan to bring all these afflictions and these things into Job's life. So he says, my complaint is not necessarily with men. And then verse number 5, he says, verses 2, he said, listen to me. But then in verse number 5, he says, mark me or look upon me. And then he says, and I want you to be astonished, I guess because of all the things he was going through. Remember, he still had this horrible disease he was dealing with here. But then he says to lay your hand upon your mouth. And you sometimes if you see something or you hear something, it kind of surprises you, you do like that right there. And that's what Job was saying here. That's what they tended to do to him when they saw him. And something to keep in mind here, this response here that Job had, it wasn't just off the top of his head. I mean, it included a lot of basic facts of life and death, and that's what we're going to see throughout the rest of the chapter, here in chapter number 21, because according to Job's point of view, and I believe Job's point of view here was right, he refutes or he disagrees with some of the claims that Zophar had made in chapter number 20 about the wicked. Remember the 3 things that Zophar said about the wicked? He says their life is brief, their pleasure is temporary, and their death is painful. And that may not necessarily always be true, and that's what Job is about to talk about here. So let's read verses 7 through 16 and see how he refutes this first accusation or this first claim that Zophar had made. So chapter number 21, verse 7. Wherefore do the wicked live, become old, yea, are mighty in power. Their seed is established in their sight with them, and their offspring before their eyes. Their houses are safe from fear, neither is the rod of God upon them. Their bull gendereth, and faileth not. Their cow calveth, and casteth not her calf. They send forth their little ones like a flock, and their children dance. They take the timbrel and the harp and rejoice in the sound of the organ. They spend their days in wealth, and in a moment go down to the grave. Therefore they say unto God, depart from us, for we desire not the knowledge of thy ways. What is the Almighty that we should serve him? And what profit should we have if we pray unto him? Lo, their good is not in their hand. The counsel of the wicked is far from me. So notice some of the things here that Job, again, now he's refuting Zophar's claim that the life of the wicked is always brief. Job here says in verse 7, he says, sometimes they become old and they become mighty in power. And in verses 8 and 9, and also in verses 11 and 12, he talks about how they have security. He says their children and their homes are safe. And then in verse number 10, in today's terms, we could say that their businesses prosper, because it says their bull gendereth and faileth not, their cow calveth and casteth not her calf. So that would be their businesses right back then. So it says their businesses prosper. And in verse number 13, he talks about how sometimes they live long and prosperous lives. So we know that to be true as well. I mean, we know people that, they haven't lived for God all their life, but it seems like they just, get wealth, and everything they do just seems to prosper. And we don't understand that a lot of times. And I refer back to Psalm 73, Asaph's psalm, where he didn't understand that either, why the wicked seemed to prosper. He said until he went into the house of the Lord and he understood those things. So we see those same things today, and that's what Job here is saying to Zophar. He says, sometimes it may be true, their life may be brief, but then a lot of times it may not be true. And it's kind of ironic. Job, here his situation was just the opposite. We know he wasn't a wicked man, but his situation was right the opposite, right? He wasn't prospering. He had lost everything he had, and he was suffering, and he was a righteous man. But we need to keep in mind, though, verse 14 and 15 talks about how that the most common mistake a lot of times that the prosperous man does make is that they leave God out of their lives. And that's what Job says here in verse number 14 and 15. He says they don't need to, that's the mistake they made. They don't, verse number 15, it says, what is the Almighty that we should serve him? And what profit should we have if we pray to him? That's what the wicked and the ungodly man asks. Why should we do these things? But notice Job in verse number 16, he's quick to point out that that's not his philosophy. His philosophy of life is that he acknowledges that everything and all blessings come from the Lord in verse number 16. So he argues here with Zophar a little bit about his claim that the life of the wicked is always brief. And secondly, he argues a little bit about how that the wicked, they don't always necessarily experience problems and calamity in their life either. Let's read verses 17 through 21. It says, how oft is the candle of the wicked put out, and how oft cometh their destruction upon them. God distributeth sorrows in his anger. They are as stubble before the wind, and as chaff that the storm carrieth away. God layeth up his iniquity for his children. He rewardeth him, and he shall know it. His eyes shall see his destruction, and he shall drink of the wrath of the Almighty. For what pleasure hath he in his house after him, when the number of his months is cut off in the midst? So remember, Zophar had claimed that the pleasures of the wicked were always just temporary because God's judgment fell on them suddenly. But Job here, he kind of refutes that here a little bit, doesn't he? Look what he's, in verse 17, he asks the question 2 times. He says, Zophar, he says, how often have you actually seen this in your life, that's the case, that the pleasures is only temporary? And as I've already mentioned, a lot of times, wicked people live all their lives, seem like, in pleasure, and they have no regard for God at all. And that's just, it's just a fact of life. Don't really have an explanation as to why they can get away with it. We know they won't ultimately, though, because we know that what the ultimate judgment is for the wicked man. So Job here, he refutes that claim as well by Zophar. And then the rest of the chapter, he refutes Zophar's claim also that the death of the wicked is always painful. And let's read these verses here in chapter 21, verses 22 through the rest of the chapter. Chapter 21, verses 22. It says, shall any teach God knowledge, seeing he judgeth those that are high? One dieth in his full strength, being wholly at ease and quiet. His breasts are full of milk, and his bones are moistened with marrow. And another dieth in bitterness of his soul, and never eateth with pleasure. They shall lie down alike in the dust, and the worms shall cover them. Behold, I know your thoughts, and the devices which you wrongfully imagine against me. For you say, let me finish reading this chapter and I'll stop. Where is the house of the prince, and where are the dwelling places of the wicked? Have you not asked them that go by the way? And do you not know their tokens, that the wicked is reserved to the day of destruction? They shall be brought forth to the day of wrath. Who shall declare his way in his face? And who shall repay him what he hath done? Yet shall he be brought to the grave, and shall remain in the tomb. The clods of the valley shall be sweet unto him, and every man shall draw after him, as there are innumerable before him. How then comfort ye me in vain, seeing in your answers there remaineth falsehood. So Lord willing, we'll take up here in chapter 21, finish up Job's response to Zophar and how he's refuting some of these claims that Zophar had to make here, and we'll start back in Job 21, verse 22 in 2 weeks. Brother Wayne, Lord willing, will be teaching next week, so be praying for him so he gets the lesson put together for next week. Thank you.